Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where death was never far away, where every cough could become a funeral, where every journey beyond the village gate carried risks no map could predict, and where the sound of church bells often meant another neighbor had quietly disappeared from the living. Imagine waking before dawn in a small medieval village, not knowing whether you would still be alive by sunset. There were no modern hospitals, no antibiotics, no reliable painkillers, and almost no certainty that tomorrow would come. To die in the Middle Ages was not simply an event waiting at the end of life. It was a companion that walked beside nearly everyone from the moment they were born. Tonight, rather than following kings or famous battles, we will spend our time beside ordinary people whose names history rarely remembered. We will walk through muddy streets, dim cottages, crowded monasteries, lonely forests, plague-stricken towns, and quiet churchyards to understand what dying actually felt like in medieval Europe. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy slow historical journeys like this one. Now dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, perhaps pour a warm drink, and let us slowly step into a world where every heartbeat was precious because no one knew how many remained. The story begins in a small English village sometime during the late 13th century. Morning arrives not with alarm clocks but with the crowing of roosters and the distant ringing of the parish bell. The cottages are built from timber, woven branches, and thick layers of mud plaster. Smoke curls through tiny holes in thatched roofs because proper chimneys remain uncommon for ordinary families. The smell of damp earth mixes with wood smoke, livestock, and freshly baked coarse bread. Now children wake on straw mattresses stuffed with dried grass. Their parents stretch aching muscles after another restless night spent sharing a single room with animals separated only by a wooden partition. For a peasant named Thomas, life begins before sunrise almost every day. His hands already bear scars despite being only 35 years old. Yet by medieval standards, he is fortunate. Many of the children born alongside him never reached adulthood. His own mother once told him that nearly every family buried infants. It was so common that people learned not to celebrate a baby's survival too early. Even after baptism, parents understood that disease could appear without warning. Death was woven into daily conversation. A child might watch neighbors carry a simple wooden coffin toward the churchyard while continuing to play with carved wooden toys only hours later. Bells tolled frequently enough that nobody stopped working every time they heard them. Sorrow remained real, but familiarity softened its surprise. Every household expected loss sooner or later. Thomas remembers his younger sister Margaret. She had laughed constantly during one unusually warm summer. Then came a fever. At first everyone believed she simply needed rest. Herbs were gathered from nearby fields. The village wise woman prepared infusions from willow bark, mint, and honey. The priest visited to offer prayer, yet within 3 days Margaret could barely open her eyes. By the fourth morning, she no longer recognized her own parents. Before sunset, she was gone. No physician ever visited the cottage because none lived nearby. Even if one had, Thomas's family could never have afforded such attention. Medicine belonged largely to monasteries, wealthy nobles, or cities many miles away. Rural families relied on experience, prayer, local healers, and hope. Sometimes these methods genuinely eased suffering. Other times they merely gave frightened people something to do while waiting for fate to decide. As Thomas grew older, he learned that surviving childhood did not guarantee a long life. Farming itself could kill, heavy carts overturned, oxen kicked without warning, sharp tools slipped during harvest. An infected cut no larger than a fingernail might become deadly within days. Today, such an injury would seem insignificant. In medieval Europe, it could quietly end everything. One autumn afternoon, Thomas slices his palm while repairing a wooden fence. The wound is washed with cold water from a nearby stream. His wife wraps it tightly using clean linen that had been carefully saved for emergencies. At first, the cut appears harmless, yet by the second day, the skin feels hot. By the third, red streaks begin creeping along his arm. His wife notices the swelling before he does. The village priest suggests confession because no one knows whether the infection will stop. The local healer applies crushed garlic and herbs believed to draw out corruption. Thomas drinks bitter mixtures that taste more like damp soil than medicine. He continues working because crops cannot wait, even while chills spread through his body. Fortunately for Thomas, his immune system wins this quiet battle. Within another week, the swelling begins to disappear. He survives, yet everyone around him can name someone who did not. His neighbor William died after stepping on a rusty nail while gathering firewood. Another man developed a fever after a splinter lodged beneath his fingernail. Neither injury looked serious at first. This constant uncertainty shaped medieval thinking. Every ordinary task carried invisible risks. A simple toothache might eventually spread infection through the jaw. Childbirth threatened both mother and infant. Winter starvation weakened entire villages. Contaminated wells spread sickness without anyone understanding invisible bacteria. Because disease remained mysterious, explanations often blended observation with religious belief. Many believed illness reflected God's will, personal sin, bad air, unlucky stars, or spiritual forces beyond human understanding. These explanations provided emotional comfort because random suffering felt unbearable without meaning. When someone became gravely ill, family members gathered quickly. There was little expectation of long hospital stays or intensive medical treatment. Instead, the dying usually remained at home surrounded by familiar voices. Candles flickered softly against rough wooden walls. Prayers filled the silence between shallow breaths. Children watched quietly from corners, learning early that death belonged inside the household rather than hidden away elsewhere. If Thomas himself were dying, the priest would hurry to administer the last rites. Confession carried enormous importance because medieval Christians believed the condition of one's soul at death shaped eternity. Neighbors often joined in prayer, believing their presence could strengthen both the dying person and those left behind. Imagine lying on a straw mattress while winter winds whistle through gaps in the cottage walls. Every breath becomes heavier than the last. Your family kneels nearby. Outside, life continues almost normally. Someone chops wood. Chickens scratch frozen ground. A dog barks somewhere beyond the fields. Inside the room, however, time seems to slow until each heartbeat becomes noticeable. There would be fear, certainly, yet there might also be acceptance. Death visited so frequently that people spent much of their lives preparing spiritually for its arrival. Sermons reminded believers that earthly existence remained temporary. Art inside churches often depicted skeletons beside kings and peasants alike, quietly teaching that wealth offered no escape from mortality. For many medieval people, the greatest terror was not dying itself, but dying suddenly without confession or proper preparation. An unexpected accident denied opportunities to reconcile with family, settle disputes, repay debts, or seek forgiveness before God. A peaceful death surrounded by loved ones became almost an ideal ending despite the suffering that often preceded it. As evening settles across Thomas's village, Smoke rises lazily from dozens of cottages. Somewhere a woman rocks her sick child while whispering prayers learned from her own mother. An elderly farmer coughs beside the fire, unaware that the illness growing inside his lungs will never truly leave. A pregnant young wife silently wonders whether she will survive the birth awaiting her in only a few weeks. None of them can see the future. None knows whose funeral bell will ring next. The village itself appears peaceful beneath the fading orange sky. Yet beneath that quiet surface exists a fragile balance between life and death that every medieval family understands without speaking aloud. Tomorrow the fields will again fill with workers. Bread will again be baked. Children will again laugh beside muddy roads. But somewhere, perhaps in the next cottage or perhaps in Thomas's own home, another ordinary life will begin its final journey, not with dramatic battles or famous last words, but with a fever, an injury, or a breath that simply never comes quite as easily as the one before. And it is with that quiet uncertainty hanging over the village, as darkness settles across the fields and church bells wait silently for the next dawn, that our journey into what it was truly like to die in the Middle Ages is only just beginning. The first pale light of dawn crept slowly across the frost-covered fields, turning every blade of grass into something that shimmered for only a few brief moments before the warmth of the rising sun erased it. Thomas stepped outside his cottage, flexing stiff fingers that still ached whenever the weather turned cold. The scar across his palm, left behind by the infection that had nearly taken his life months earlier, served as a quiet reminder that survival in his world often depended on fortune as much as strength. Around him, the village stirred awake in familiar rhythms. Smoke drifted upward from thatched roofs. Chickens wandered between muddy paths, somewhere. Nearby, an infant cried while an elderly woman coughed with the deep, rattling sound that seemed to echo through her chest every winter. No one paid much attention to the coughing anymore. Old Agnes had been coughing for nearly 3 years. Some days she looked almost healthy, sitting outside her doorway spinning wool while children chased each other through the lane. Other days she barely possessed enough strength to lift a wooden cup of watered ale. Illness in the Middle Ages rarely followed the neat beginning, middle, and end that modern people often imagine. Many diseases lingered for months or even years, slowly wearing the body away until family members hardly noticed how dramatically someone had changed. Agnes herself no longer expected to recover. She had accepted that each winter might become her last, yet acceptance did not mean despair. Every morning she still whispered the same prayer before opening her door, thanking God for another sunrise. Her neighbors admired this quiet resilience. To them, endurance carried its own kind of dignity. One did not complain loudly about suffering because suffering belonged to everyone. As Thomas crossed the village green carrying a bundle of firewood, he noticed Agnes sitting unusually still. Her daughter Ellen knelt beside her, gently wrapping another blanket around her shoulders despite the growing sunlight. Agnes smiled faintly as Thomas approached. "You've gathered enough wood for half the village," she joked between shallow breaths. Thomas smiled back, though he immediately sensed something had changed. Her face appeared thinner than only a week before. The skin beneath her eyes had darkened, and every sentence seemed to cost her more effort than the last. In a medieval village, people became skilled at recognizing these subtle signs. They could not diagnose tuberculosis, pneumonia, heart failure, or cancer because such words meant nothing to them. Yet experience had taught them when someone's strength had begun slipping beyond recovery. Throughout the day, neighbors quietly stopped by Agnes's cottage. No one announced that she was dying. Such declarations were unnecessary. Everyone simply understood. One woman brought fresh bread. Another carried a small pot of onion soup. The blacksmith's wife delivered clean linen. The children gathered flowers from the edge of the forest without fully understanding why adults suddenly spoke in softer voices. This quiet generosity reflected something deeply important about medieval communities. Survival depended upon one another. When illness entered one household, it often became everyone's concern. There were no professional nursing homes, no emergency services, no hospice organizations. Families and neighbors formed the entire system of care. Inside Agnes's cottage, the atmosphere remained calm rather than frantic. A small fire crackled gently beneath an iron pot suspended over glowing embers. Dried herbs hung from ceiling beams. Beeswax candles waited nearby, ready to be lit after sunset. Ellen carefully washed her mother's face with warm water before combing the thinning strands of gray hair away from her forehead. These small acts mattered enormously. The cleanliness carried spiritual as well as practical meaning. Preparing the body respectfully reflected love, dignity, and readiness for whatever came next. By evening, the village priest arrived carrying a small leather satchel. Inside rested the sacred objects needed for the final rites. Everyone inside the cottage instinctively stepped aside as he entered. Modern audiences often imagine medieval religion only through grand cathedrals and elaborate ceremonies. Yet most people's deepest religious experiences occurred inside homes exactly like this one. A simple room illuminated by flickering candlelight became, for a few quiet moments, as sacred as any magnificent church. The priest spoke gently with Agnes. He did not promise recovery. He did not pretend certainty about tomorrow. Instead, he invited her to reflect upon her life. She confessed old regrets that had lingered for decades. She prayed for her late husband. She asked forgiveness for moments of anger she still remembered from raising her children. Her daughter quietly wept while pretending to rearrange blankets so her mother would not notice. When the prayers ended, silence filled the room. Outside, rain began falling softly against the thatched roof. No one hurried to leave. There existed an understanding that the dying should never be abandoned. Hours passed. Sometimes Agnes slept. Sometimes she opened her eyes and watched flames dancing within the fireplace. Sometimes she whispered memories from childhood that no one had heard for 50 years. One moment she described gathering berries beside her younger brother during a summer long before the current king had even been born. The next she asked whether the chickens had been fed. Her mind drifted gently between past and present. Today, doctors recognize that many dying people experience changing awareness during their final days. Medieval families noticed the same phenomenon without possessing medical explanations. They simply accepted that the boundary between this world and the next seemed to become thinner as death approached. Meanwhile, life outside refused to stop. Thomas still had fields to plow. The miller still ground grain. The baker still prepared bread before dawn. Children still argued over wooden toys. Perhaps this is one of the strangest truths about death in every age. For the individual, everything is ending. For everyone else, ordinary life quietly continues. Several days later, Agnes's breathing changed. Each inhale became slower. Each pause lasted longer. Family members instinctively leaned closer after every breath, wondering whether another would follow. No clocks measured these final hours. The time became counted through candle flames burning lower, through logs collapsing into glowing ash, through changing light beyond the tiny window. At one point, Agnes opened her eyes with surprising clarity. She looked directly at Ellen. "I was afraid," she whispered. Her daughter squeezed her hand. "I know, but not anymore." Those were among her final words. Shortly afterward, her breathing gradually slowed until, almost imperceptibly, it ceased altogether. No dramatic final gasp. No sudden movement. Only stillness. The silence that followed felt almost louder than any cry. Ellen remained holding her mother's hand for several minutes before quietly closing her eyes. No one rushed forward. Death deserved patience. Eventually, the priest softly recited prayers for the departed soul. Outside, dawn birds had already begun singing once again. Within hours, practical responsibilities replaced grief. Death required work. The body needed washing. Fresh clothing had to be prepared. Neighbors helped construct a simple wooden coffin using planks already stored for exactly this purpose. Medieval people rarely waited until someone died to think about burial materials. Every village expected death regularly enough that such preparations remained almost routine. Women gently washed Agnes's body using warmed water scented with herbs. Her hands were folded peacefully across her chest. Candles surrounded the bed. Throughout the day, neighbors visited to pay respects. Children entered quietly under their parents' guidance. Unlike many modern societies, medieval communities rarely shielded children from death itself. Young boys and girls often saw grandparents, siblings, and neighbors after death. While emotionally difficult, this familiarity meant death remained understood as part of life's natural rhythm rather than something hidden behind hospital walls. That evening, the church bell rang slowly. Each toll spread across fields and forests alike. Travelers passing nearby immediately recognized its meaning. Someone had died. The following morning, the funeral procession formed outside the cottage. There were no polished hearses, no elaborate flower arrangements. 4 villagers carried the wooden coffin upon their shoulders, while family followed behind. The muddy road leading toward the parish church had been walked countless times before. Every generation traveled this same final path. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through colored glass, scattering muted reds and blues across worn stone floors. Incense drifted gently through cool air. Familiar prayers echoed against ancient walls that had witnessed hundreds of funerals before this one and would witness hundreds more after. For ordinary medieval people, burial within consecrated ground offered profound comfort. Families believed their loved ones rested among fellow believers while awaiting the resurrection promised by their faith. After the service, Agnes's coffin was lowered carefully into the earth. Soil struck wood with a dull, unmistakable sound. Many mourners quietly crossed themselves. Others remained silently watching until the grave had completely disappeared beneath fresh earth. Within only a few weeks, grass would begin growing again. Eventually, another burial might take place nearby. Centuries later, archaeologists would discover rows of such graves, each representing an ordinary life largely forgotten by written history, but once deeply loved by families exactly like Agnes's. Thomas lingered beside the churchyard after everyone else had begun returning home. He looked across dozens of simple wooden markers weathered by wind and rain. Some belonged to infants, others to young mothers, some to elderly villagers who had somehow survived decades of hardship before finally surrendering to age. Standing there, Thomas realized something his father had once told him when he himself was only a child. We do not fear the grave because everyone we have ever loved is already waiting there. It was not spoken with Agnes. It was spoken with quiet certainty. Yet even as Thomas turned back toward the village, another reminder of mortality was already approaching along the distant road. A merchant's cart rolled slowly toward the settlement, its driver exhausted after weeks of travel across towns and monasteries. He carried sacks of wool, small barrels of salt, and without realizing it, something far more dangerous than any weapon. Invisible to every eye, hidden within fleas riding black rats beneath the cart's wooden boards, a new threat had begun its journey. Neither Thomas nor anyone in the village could possibly know that before long they would witness not merely the peaceful passing of one elderly woman, but death on a scale so overwhelming that entire communities would struggle to bury their dead. The quiet church bell that had mourned Agnes alone would soon ring so often that eventually it would fall silent altogether. The merchant arrived just before noon, his horse moving with the slow, uneven gait of an animal that had crossed far too many miles without proper rest. Dust clung to the wheels of his cart despite the recent rain, and his boots were stiff with dried mud collected from roads stretching across several counties. Villagers greeted him warmly, as they usually greeted travelers. News from the outside world was a rare luxury. A passing merchant brought not only salt, cloth, needles, and iron tools, but also stories of distant fairs, changing harvests, wandering pilgrims, and occasional whispers of political disputes among nobles whose decisions rarely improved the lives of ordinary people. Thomas helped unload several barrels near the village storehouse. The merchant, whose name was Richard, looked older than his years. His beard had grown untidy during the journey, and exhaustion showed in every movement. When offered a cup of ale, he accepted gratefully and sank onto a rough wooden bench outside the tavern. "I have never seen so many funerals," he murmured after taking a long drink. The men around him exchanged curious glances. "Where?" one of them asked. Richard stared into his cup before answering. "In the ports to the south." Nobody reacted with alarm. Funeral processions were hardly unusual. Villages often experienced outbreaks of fever or dysentery after unusually wet summers. Death belonged to every season. "They say a strange sickness follows the trading ships," Richard continued quietly. "Some swear entire streets have emptied." An older farmer laughed softly. "Every traveler returns with stories that grow larger the farther they travel." Several others nodded in agreement. Rumors spread almost as easily as merchants themselves. Tales of dragons in distant mountains, miraculous relics that healed blindness, saints appearing beside lonely roads, or entire castles haunted by restless spirits drifted across medieval Europe alongside genuine news. Most listeners learned to greet dramatic claims with polite skepticism. Thomas listened without speaking. Something about Richard's expression unsettled him. The merchant did not sound like a man exaggerating events to entertain strangers. He sounded like someone trying to make sense of things he scarcely understood himself. As evening approached, Richard rented a corner inside the village inn. His horse was fed. His goods remained safely stored beneath shelter. Tomorrow he intended to continue north. But tomorrow would not unfold as planned. Before sunrise, the innkeeper discovered Richard shivering violently beneath his blanket. Sweat soaked his clothes despite the cool morning air. His skin burned with fever. At first, everyone assumed the journey had simply exhausted him. Travel itself often weakened the body. Weeks spent sleeping outdoors, drinking questionable water, and eating spoiled food frequently resulted in illness. The village healer prepared herbal infusions. Cold cloths were placed across his forehead. The priest visited to offer prayers. Nothing seemed especially unusual. Yet by the following evening, Richard's fever had climbed even higher. He struggled to remain conscious. His breathing became shallow. Then something appeared beneath his arm. A painful swelling. Round, dark, tender enough that merely touching the skin caused him to cry out. The healer frowned. She had seen swollen glands before, but never quite like this. Within another day, a second swelling emerged near his groin. His condition deteriorated astonishingly fast. Even Thomas, who had witnessed many illnesses throughout his life, sensed that this sickness behaved differently. Richard no longer recognized familiar faces. Sometimes he spoke to people who were not present. Sometimes he reached toward empty corners of the room as though watching invisible figures standing there. His fever transformed reality into something neither he nor those around him could fully understand. Modern medicine recognizes severe infections can produce delirium, confusion, and terrifying hallucinations. Medieval observers interpreted such moments through entirely different beliefs. Some wondered whether demons tormented the dying. Others believed angels had already begun drawing near. No one truly knew. On the fourth morning, Richard died. His death shocked the village not because people rarely died, but because everything had happened with frightening speed. Only days earlier, he had walked beside his horse. Now preparations for another funeral had already begun. His cart remained where he had left it. His horse stood patiently within the stable. The villagers buried him with the same dignity they offered anyone else. Life resumed, or at least they believed it had. Several days later, the innkeeper's youngest son developed a fever. Then one of the stable hands. Soon afterward, the blacksmith's apprentice complained of painful swelling beneath his neck. The village healer hurried constantly between cottages. She prepared more herbal mixtures than ever before. Willow bark, garlic, rosemary, honey, vinegar compresses. Nothing slowed the illness. Every morning brought another patient. Every evening ended with another family praying beside a bedside. Fear spread gradually rather than all at once. At first, people searched for simple explanations. Perhaps the well had become contaminated. Perhaps spoiled meat had been sold at the recent market. Perhaps unusual weather had poisoned the air. The medieval belief in bad air or miasma seemed entirely reasonable to people lacking knowledge of bacteria or viruses. Rotting smells often accompanied disease, leading many to conclude that foul air itself carried sickness. Some villagers began burning fragrant herbs inside their homes. Others avoided strangers. Many remained indoors whenever possible. Yet the illness continued advancing from household to household with unnerving determination. Thomas visited the blacksmith one afternoon, expecting to discuss repairs to a plow. Instead, he found the man's workshop silent. The forge had grown cold. The tools rested untouched, exactly where they had been left days earlier. Inside the cottage, the blacksmith lay beneath heavy blankets, his face pale beneath beads of sweat. His wife looked utterly exhausted. "I have not slept," she admitted quietly. Thomas noticed another detail. The woman's hands trembled. Not from age, not from grief, from fever. She too had become ill. Within medieval households, sickness rarely affected only one individual. Families lived close together. Several generations often shared a single room. Separate bedrooms were luxuries enjoyed only by wealthier households. Illness spread through constant proximity, though nobody understood precisely how. Over the following week, funerals multiplied. The parish priest found himself conducting burial after burial until the words of familiar prayers seemed to blend together. The church bell rang so often that villagers no longer counted its tolls. Children stopped playing as loudly. Laughter became uncommon. Doors remained closed. Smoke rose from cottages where entire families remained isolated together. Every knock upon the door now carried uncertainty. Would it bring help, or news that another neighbor had died? Thomas's own household remained healthy for the moment. Each morning he thanked God simply because his wife still smiled across the breakfast table. Each evening he silently wondered whether either of them might wake with fever tomorrow. Sleep itself became difficult. Every cough heard during the night caused immediate concern. Every headache seemed suspicious. Every ache inspired quiet dread. Modern readers often imagine plague as something instantly catastrophic. The reality proved psychologically slower and perhaps even more frightening. Communities watched death approach one familiar face at a time. Neighbors disappeared gradually until people realized entire sections of the village had fallen strangely silent. The emotional burden became almost unbearable. There was scarcely enough time to grieve one funeral before another demanded attention. Families who had comforted grieving neighbors one week found themselves receiving condolences the next. Eventually, the healer herself became sick. This frightened the village more than almost anything else. She represented experience, knowledge, hope. If even she could not escape, what chance remained for anyone else? Lying weakly upon her own bed, she apologized repeatedly to patients she could no longer visit. "I wish," she whispered to the priest. "I wish I knew how to stop it." There was heartbreaking honesty within those words. Today we often expect medicine to possess answers. In the Middle Ages, healers accepted painful limitations. They could ease suffering. They could clean wounds. They could recommend herbs. They could pray. But against certain diseases, they stood almost powerless. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently from ancient oak trees, covering village paths in quiet shades of gold and brown. Nature continued following its familiar rhythm despite human tragedy. Birds migrated south. Foxes hunted beneath moonlight. Rain nourished winter crops. The world itself appeared entirely indifferent to human sorrow. Thomas walked through the churchyard one cold evening and noticed fresh graves filling spaces that only weeks earlier had been empty. Simple wooden crosses stood in uneven rows. Some graves belonged to children who had barely learned to speak. Others belonged to husbands and wives buried only days apart. One family had lost 3 generations within a single fortnight. Standing there beneath the fading light, Thomas found himself asking a question countless medieval people must have whispered in moments of overwhelming grief. Why? Not why people died. Everyone understood death. But why so many? And why now? No answer came. Only the distant sound of another bell. Another household. Another final breath. And as darkness settled once again across the frightened village, few could imagine that this terrible outbreak, devastating though it already seemed, represented only a faint shadow of something vastly greater moving silently across Europe. Far beyond their fields, beyond the forests, beyond the castles and monasteries they would never see, Entire cities were beginning to collapse under the weight of a catastrophe that future generations would remember simply as the Black Death ***. For Thomas and his neighbors, however, that terrifying name had not yet been spoken. They still believed they were witnessing the worst suffering imaginable, unaware that history itself was about to enter one of its darkest chapters. Far to the south, beyond the quiet fields Thomas had known since childhood, the roads grew wider, the towns busier, and the ports louder. Merchant vessels arrived almost daily from distant shores, carrying spices from the east, fine silks, barrels of wine, precious metals, wool, timber, and countless passengers whose names would never appear in history books. These ships also carried something no customs official could inspect, no guard could confiscate, and no priest could bless away. Hidden beneath sacks of grain and bundled cloth, black rats slipped unnoticed through the darkness of wooden hulls. Nestled among their fur were tiny fleas that had already fed upon infected animals in lands hundreds of miles away. Neither sailors nor merchants had the slightest understanding that creatures so small they were nearly invisible would help reshape the history of an entire continent. To the people of the 14th century, disease never arrived with an explanation. It simply appeared. One week, a bustling marketplace overflowed with voices bargaining over fish, bread, leather, and candles. The following week, those same streets echoed with funeral processions. In the thriving port city of Bristol, life had always been noisy. Fishermen shouted before sunrise as boats returned with their catch. Apprentices hurried through narrow streets carrying tools for blacksmiths and carpenters. Bakers filled the air with the comforting smell of fresh bread before dawn had fully broken. Church bells marked the passing hours while traders argued cheerfully over prices in crowded squares. Among these, ordinary citizens lived a cooper named John. His profession was simple. He made barrels. Every day he shaped oak staves, hammered iron hoops into place, and sold finished barrels to merchants transporting everything from salted meat to ale. It was honest work. Demand remained constant. Barrels were essential to medieval commerce. John expected his greatest worries to involve rising timber prices or damaged tools. Instead, he would soon witness something no craftsman had ever imagined. The first signs appeared almost quietly. A dockworker failed to report for work. Then another. A tavern owner closed unexpectedly because his wife had fallen ill. Within days, whispers spread across the marketplace. People spoke of strange swellings, high fevers, blackened skin, deaths occurring within only a handful of days. Some dismissed the stories. The cities always contained rumors. Yet the evidence became impossible to ignore. One morning, John noticed that the baker's stall remained empty. By afternoon, he learned the baker had died during the nights. The following day, the baker's eldest daughter was also dead. Before the week ended, the entire household had vanished. No customers waited outside their shop anymore. Its wooden shutters remained closed. Fresh loaves never again appeared in the window. For medieval people, one of the most disturbing aspects of plague was its speed. Most illnesses allowed time. Time to pray. Time to gather family. Time to prepare emotionally. The plague often stole that opportunity. Healthy people shared breakfast. By evening, they complained of chills. The next morning, they could barely stand. Soon afterward, they were gone. John's workshop stood only a few streets from the docks. Every day, he watched carts arriving from newly docked ships. Normally, this meant business. Now it inspired unease. Merchants looked frightened. Sailors hurried away from the waterfront as soon as cargo had been unloaded. Several ships floated silently in the harbor longer than usual because too few healthy men remained to unload them. The city authorities struggled to understand what was happening. Without knowledge of germs, they searched desperately for explanations. Some blamed poisonous air drifting inland from marshes. Others insisted unusual planetary alignments had corrupted nature itself. Certain preachers declared that humanity faced divine punishment for widespread sin. Groups of deeply religious penitents marched through streets praying loudly while whipping themselves, believing public acts of suffering might persuade God to end the catastrophe. Ordinary citizens desperately wanted certainty. Instead, every explanation contradicted another. One physician advised remaining indoors. Another recommended traveling into the countryside. Some encouraged burning aromatic herbs. Others urged drinking particular wines believed to strengthen the body. No remedy proved reliable. John continued working because earning money remained necessary. Even during catastrophe, families still required food. Taxes still existed. Rent still came due. Life possessed a stubborn tendency to continue demanding ordinary responsibilities despite extraordinary circumstances. Yet customers grew fewer each day, not because they lacked barrels, because many were already dead. One afternoon, a young apprentice entered John's workshop carrying a damaged ale cask. The boy appeared pale. His movements seemed unusually slow. John asked whether he felt unwell. "It's only tiredness," the apprentice replied with a weak smile. The barrel was repaired. The boy thanked him. He never returned. 3 days later, John learned that the apprentice had died before reaching his 17th birthday. Deaths accumulated so rapidly that names blurred together. Every conversation began with another loss. "Did you hear about the tailor? They buried the fishmonger yesterday. The priest from St. Mary's is gone. The miller's wife did not survive the night." Soon people stopped asking whether someone knew the deceased. Everyone did. The emotional landscape of the city transformed completely. Fear became visible. Marketplaces emptied. Parents refused to let children wander outdoors. Friends hesitated before embracing one another. Neighbors who had shared meals for decades now spoke across fences instead of entering each other's homes. Human closeness itself began to feel dangerous, though nobody fully understood why. The churches filled with frightened worshipers. Many believed sincere prayer offered their greatest protection. Others quietly questioned beliefs they had held their entire lives. If God protected the faithful, why were priests dying alongside criminals? Why did innocent children perish while hardened thieves sometimes survived? Such questions echoed silently through medieval Europe. Few dared voice them openly. John's own household remained untouched. Through the early weeks, his wife Alice insisted upon cleaning every surface with vinegar because someone had claimed it purified the air. Windows remained open despite chilly weather. Bundles of rosemary and lavender hung beside the doorway. Whether these practices truly helped mattered less than the comfort they provided. Doing something felt better than doing nothing. One evening, John's younger brother Peter arrived unexpectedly. His expression alone revealed terrible news. "Our mother is ill." Without hesitation, John followed him across the city. Their mother lived only a short distance away. She had always been remarkably healthy despite her age. When they entered her cottage, she smiled weakly from bed. "I hoped you'd come." John sat beside her for hours. They spoke about childhood, about their late father, about small memories neither brother had considered in years. Unlike many plague victims, their mother remained mentally clear. She understood exactly what might happen. "I am not afraid," she said quietly. "I only wish there had been more time." Those words settled heavily upon both sons. How many medieval people must have spoken similar sentences? Not asking for riches, not asking for miracles, only wishing life had offered a little more time. The family remained together through the night. Outside, funeral bells continued ringing somewhere beyond the narrow streets. Near dawn, their mother's breathing became increasingly labored. She reached for John's hand, then Peter's. Neither brother spoke. There were no perfect words left. As sunlight gradually entered the room, she slipped peacefully into silence. John remained seated long after she had died. He stared at the familiar face that had comforted him through childhood illnesses, celebrated his wedding, and welcomed every harvest home. Now all those memories belonged entirely to the past. Grief during plague differed from ordinary grief. There was scarcely space to experience it. Before the family had finished preparing the body, another neighbor knocked upon the door. His own wife had become feverish. Could John help? Within hours, another messenger arrived. Then another. The city itself seemed trapped inside an endless chain of emergencies. Even burial practices began changing. Ordinarily, funerals involved careful ceremonies attended by relatives and neighbors. But as deaths multiplied, there were simply too many bodies. Gravediggers worked from sunrise until darkness concealed their shovels. Priests exhausted themselves conducting service after service. Some cemeteries filled beyond capacity. New burial grounds had to be prepared outside city walls. For families already overwhelmed by loss, these hurried burials added another layer of sorrow. Many feared their loved ones were not receiving the dignified farewell tradition demanded. Yet practical necessity left few alternatives. John noticed something deeply unsettling during those weeks. The city was becoming quieter. not because people chose silence, but because there were fewer voices left. The constant clatter of workshops faded. Market stalls disappeared. Children's laughter became rare. Dogs wandered streets searching for masters who would never return. The familiar rhythm of urban life slowly unraveled. And hundreds of miles away, in villages like Thomas's, ordinary people still believed their own suffering represented an isolated tragedy. They could not yet imagine that towns, monasteries, castles, and great cities across Europe were all beginning to experience the same nightmare. The plague was no longer traveling. It had arrived. And before it finally loosened its grip on the continent, millions of lives, rich and poor, famous and forgotten, young and old, would come to an end, leaving behind a Europe forever changed in ways no survivor could yet comprehend. For those who survived the first terrifying weeks, a strange new reality gradually emerged. The plague had not simply taken lives, it had reshaped the rhythm of existence itself. Every sunrise carried an uneasy question that lingered in the minds of countless medieval people. Who would still be alive by nightfall? In Thomas's village, autumn slowly surrendered to winter. The fields, once alive with the noise of harvest, now stood unusually quiet beneath a blanket of pale frost. Several cottages remained abandoned. Their doors swung gently whenever the wind passed through the empty lane. Smoke no longer rose from their chimneys. Chickens wandered freely through neglected gardens, pecking at vegetables no one remained to gather. The absence of ordinary sounds became almost more disturbing than the funerals themselves. The blacksmith's hammer had fallen silent. The mill operated only a few days each week because there were too few healthy workers left to carry grain. The laughter of children had almost disappeared from the village green. Even the church bell rang less frequently now, not because fewer people were dying, but because the priest had grown too exhausted to announce every death individually. Sometimes several burials took place together before a single prayer. Thomas had survived another month without becoming ill, yet survival brought its own burden. Each morning, he visited another household in need. An elderly widower whose sons had died. A young mother trying to feed 3 children alone. A crippled shepherd unable to bury his own brother. The plague had turned neighbors into caretakers because there was no one else left. People shared bread not because they had plenty, but because someone nearby had none at all. One icy morning, Thomas carried a sack of oats to the cottage of William's widow. Her husband had been among the first villagers to die after developing the strange swellings beneath his arms. She greeted Thomas with tired eyes and a grateful smile. "I still expect to hear his footsteps," she admitted quietly. She glanced toward the doorway. Every evening, just before sunset. Thomas understood exactly what she meant. Grief often played cruel tricks upon the mind. Many mourners claimed they heard familiar voices in empty rooms. Others briefly believed they had seen loved ones walking across distant fields before realizing they were looking at strangers. Modern psychologists recognize these experiences as common during profound grief. Medieval people often interpreted them differently. Some believed the souls of the departed returned briefly to comfort their families. Others feared restless spirits lingered because unfinished business remained. Neither explanation removed the ache of loss. As winter deepened, another danger slowly appeared. Food. Harvests had gone unfinished. Many fields remained partly untouched because the farmers responsible for them had died before gathering their crops. Livestock wandered unattended. Some animals escaped into nearby forests. Others starved inside neglected barns. Death in the Middle Ages rarely ended with the funeral. It often created months or even years of hardship afterward. Without enough workers, villages struggled to produce enough food for those who remained alive. Ironically, however, in some regions, the enormous loss of population meant fewer mouths to feed. Entire farms stood empty, waiting for survivors willing to claim them. None of this comforted families mourning loved ones. Yet history was quietly shifting beneath their feet. Labor had suddenly become precious. A healthy worker could now demand better conditions than had been imaginable only a few years earlier. Although Thomas knew nothing of economics, he noticed subtle changes. The local Lord Steward visited the village one afternoon. Rather than issuing demands, he made requests. Workers were needed. Fields required plowing. Repairs had fallen behind. For perhaps the first time in generations, ordinary peasants found themselves possessing something unexpectedly valuable: their labor. Still, none of these changes erased the emotional wounds left behind. One snowy evening, Thomas visited Father Matthew, the village priest. The old man looked decades older than he had before the plague. His hair had turned almost completely white. Deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. Books lay open across the wooden table where he had spent countless nights recording baptisms, marriages, and burials. Thomas noticed something unusual. The burial pages had become almost impossible to read. Names crowded together. Dates repeated endlessly. The ink itself seemed hurried. Father Matthew sighed. I stopped writing every detail. Thomas looked surprised. There wasn't enough time. The priest gently closed the book. I buried too many. For centuries, parish registers would preserve fragments of these terrible months. Some pages remained neat and orderly. Then suddenly handwriting changed. Entries became shorter. Sometimes several names shared one line. Occasionally entire weeks passed without records because even the priests had become sick or died. History itself struggled to keep pace with the scale of the tragedy. Thomas helped the priest organize scattered papers before noticing another document resting beneath the candlelight. A list, not of the dead, of those still living. The names were painfully few. Entire families had vanished. Certain surnames would never again be spoken within the village. Their bloodlines had quietly ended. No monuments marked their disappearance. Only empty cottages slowly collapsing beneath wind and rain. The realization settled heavily upon Thomas. A person could live honestly, work faithfully, raise children, love deeply, and within only a generation, almost every trace of that existence might disappear. Few medieval peasants expected to become famous. Most hoped only that someone would remember them, that their children would speak their names, that prayers would occasionally be offered for their souls. When entire families vanished together, even those simple hopes sometimes disappeared. Weeks later, the snow finally began melting. Water flowed once more through shallow ditches beside the village road. Small green shoots emerged across the fields. Life, stubborn as ever, returned. Birdsong gradually replaced winter silence. Children who had survived cautiously resumed their games outdoors. The sound felt almost unfamiliar after so many months. One afternoon, Thomas watched two boys chasing each other around the ancient oak tree standing beside the churchyard. He suddenly realized something remarkable. Neither child remembered the village as it had once been. To them, abandoned cottages had always existed. Missing neighbors belonged only to stories told by adults. The plague had become part of their earliest memory. Entire generations would grow up shaped by events they were too young to understand. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded. Cities slowly reopened marketplaces. Monasteries accepted new novices to replace brothers who had died. Fields were cultivated once again. Trade cautiously resumed. Human beings possessed an extraordinary ability to rebuild. Yet beneath this recovery lingered something invisible. People had changed. Survivors viewed life differently. Many became more charitable after witnessing so much suffering. Others pursued wealth with renewed urgency, believing tomorrow could never be guaranteed. Some devoted themselves more deeply to faith. Others quietly questioned beliefs they had once accepted without hesitation. The plague had not merely transformed Europe physically. It had altered hearts and minds. Thomas himself found that every ordinary moment carried greater meaning. A warm meal, a healthy sunrise, his wife's laughter, the simple comfort of returning home after a day's work. Before the plague, these had seemed ordinary. Now they felt precious. Years later, when travelers asked older villagers about the terrible sickness, conversations rarely began with numbers. No one spoke of percentages or statistics. Instead, they remembered faces. The baker who always gave children an extra loaf. The blacksmith whose laugh echoed across the square. Old Agnes spinning wool beneath the morning sun. Richard the weary merchant who unknowingly carried death into their peaceful village. History would eventually call the catastrophe the Black Death. Scholars would debate where it began. Doctors would later understand bacteria, fleas, and rats. Archaeologists would uncover mass graves. Historians would calculate unimaginable death tolls. But for people like Thomas, none of those future discoveries mattered. The plague had never been a statistic. It had been neighbors, friends, parents, children, and every empty chair beside a fire reminded survivors of lives that numbers could never fully describe. As another spring settled gently across the medieval countryside, Thomas stood outside his cottage watching new leaves unfold upon the old oak tree. Nature had begun another cycle, indifferent to human grief, yet somehow offering quiet reassurance that life continued. He could not know that historians centuries later would study his era with fascination. He could not imagine hospitals, microscopes, antibiotics, or modern medicine. He knew only what stood before him. The sun set. Hill rose. Seeds still grew. Church bells still echoed across the valley. And for those fortunate enough to hear them, every ordinary day had become a gift far more fragile than they had ever understood before. Years passed. Not many. Just enough for the sharpest pain to soften into something quieter. The abandoned cottages gradually disappeared beneath climbing ivy. Roofs that had once sheltered families finally collapsed under the weight of winter snow and relentless rain. Apple trees planted by forgotten hands continued producing fruit each autumn, even though no children remained to climb their branches. Nature possessed no memory. People did. Thomas was now approaching 50 years of age. For a medieval peasant, that alone felt almost miraculous. When he looked into the polished surface of a bucket filled with water, he noticed deep lines around his eyes that had not existed before the plague. His beard had become streaked with gray. Years of lifting timber, turning heavy soil, and carrying sacks of grain had bent his back slightly forward. Yet he remained one of the fortunate ones. He was still alive. The strange thing about surviving great disasters is that life eventually begins to feel ordinary again. Fields must still be planted. Animals still require feeding. Roofs still leak. Children still scrape their knees. Even after witnessing unimaginable loss, the routine demands of daily existence slowly reclaim attention. This quiet return to normality often puzzled later historians. How could medieval people continue living after seeing entire communities disappear? The answer was simple. Because they had no alternative. One spring morning, Thomas and several neighbors gathered to repair the village bridge. The old wooden structure had deteriorated badly during the years when too few workers remained alive to maintain it. As they worked, a young laborer named Robert asked Thomas a question. Were things truly as terrible as people say? Thomas rested his hammer for a moment. Robert had been born shortly after the plague. Everything he knew came from stories. Thomas searched for words. It was quieter. Robert frowned. Quieter. Thomas nodded. People always remember the dying. He looked toward the river flowing gently beneath the bridge. But what I remember most was the silence afterward. That answer lingered in Robert's thoughts long after the day's work ended. Silence. Not battle. Not screams. Silence. Entire medieval landscapes had experienced that silence. Villages where no forge rang through the morning. Monasteries where only half the choir remained alive to sing prayers. Market squares missing familiar voices. The absence of ordinary sound became one of the plague's longest-lasting scars. Yet time refused to stop. New families arrived from neighboring regions. Some abandoned farms found new owners. Children were born into houses where previous generations had died. Life slowly stitched itself back together, not perfectly, but enough to continue. Thomas often visited the churchyard in the evenings. Many of the wooden grave markers placed during the plague had already begun rotting away. Rain erased names. Wind loosened carved crosses. Grass spread evenly across old burial sites until newcomers could scarcely distinguish one grave from another. This troubled him, not because he believed the dead had been forgotten by God. His faith remained strong. He worried they might be forgotten by people. One afternoon, he found Father Matthew kneeling beside several weathered graves. The priest, now an old man with trembling hands, carefully replaced a broken wooden cross. "It won't last," Thomas observed. Father Matthew smiled gently. "No. Then why replace it?" The priest brushed damp soil from his fingers. "Because someone should remember they were here." Those words stayed with Thomas for many years. Because someone should remember. History often celebrates kings, victorious generals, great explorers, powerful queens. Yet the overwhelming majority of medieval people left almost nothing behind. No portraits, no written diaries, no magnificent tombs. Only scattered bones beneath churchyards and the quiet echoes of lives once fully lived. Thomas thought frequently about Richard, the merchant whose arrival had unknowingly changed everything. He had possessed no evil intentions. He had not carried plague deliberately. He himself had become one of its earliest victims. History sometimes unfolds through ordinary people making ordinary journeys without realizing they stand at the beginning of extraordinary events. The merchant had simply wanted to sell his goods. Instead, he became part of one of Europe's greatest tragedies. One unusually warm summer, travelers passing through the village brought astonishing news. A university physician in a distant city claimed the plague had finally disappeared. Others disagreed. Yes. Ohm insisted isolated outbreaks continued. No one truly knew. Communication remained slow. Reliable information traveled no faster than horses or ships. Even so, people gradually allowed themselves something they had almost forgotten: hope. Markets became busier. Church festivals returned. Wedding celebrations grew more frequent. Music once again drifted across village greens during harvest feasts. Laughter sounded less unusual. The children born after the plague could scarcely understand why older villagers sometimes fell silent during joyful occasions. For survivors, happiness itself occasionally felt unfamiliar. Thomas experienced this one autumn evening while attending his niece's wedding. The hall overflowed with music. Neighbors danced. Ale flowed generously. Fresh bread and roasted pork covered long wooden tables. Everyone celebrated. Then suddenly, during the middle of a cheerful song, Thomas glanced towards several empty seats. No one occupied them. His brother would have sat there. Old Agnes would have smiled from another corner. The blacksmith would almost certainly have been singing louder than everyone else. For just a heartbeat, Thomas imagined them all present again. Then the music continued. Reality returned. Grief never completely vanished. It simply learned to live quietly beside happiness. As Thomas grew older, another truth slowly became impossible to ignore. The plague had not defeated death. It had merely reminded everyone how close death had always been. Old age still approached. Winter illnesses still claimed lives. Childbirth remained dangerous. Accidents still happened without warning. Even after surviving history's greatest epidemic, medieval existence remained profoundly fragile. One frosty morning, Thomas awoke with stiffness that refused to disappear. His knees hurt. His breathing felt slightly shorter during heavy work. Nothing dramatic. Only age. There existed no cure for growing old. No physician promised renewed youth. Most people accepted the gradual weakening of the body with quiet resignation. Thomas himself had watched enough lives end to understand that reaching old age represented an extraordinary privilege. Many friends never received that opportunity. His wife sometimes teased him gently whenever he rubbed his aching back after working the fields. "You complain more than you did at 20. Thomas laughed. "I survived plague." She smiled. "And now you're defeated by your own bones." They laughed together. Simple moments like these had become precious beyond measure. The older Thomas became, the less he valued grand ambitions. Instead, he treasured ordinary evenings beside the fire. Fresh bread shared with family. The sound of rain safely falling outside while everyone remained warm indoors. Watching grandchildren chase chickens across muddy yards. Perhaps this was one of the plague's greatest unseen legacies. It taught survivors that ordinary life itself was extraordinary. Not because it lasted forever, but because it didn't. As another winter approached, Father Matthew finally passed away peacefully in his sleep. Unlike so many others, he received the quiet death he had helped provide for countless villagers throughout his lifetime. Nearly the entire community attended his funeral. Young and old alike remembered how many dying hands he had held during the darkest months of the plague. When the service ended, Thomas remained standing beside the fresh grave long after others had returned home. The churchyard looked different now. Many graves had become anonymous beneath grass. Others remained marked by newer stones carved by descendants. Generations rested together beneath the same peaceful earth. Thomas found himself wondering something he had never considered as a younger man. When his own time arrived, how would it happen? Would illness come slowly? Would it be sudden? Would his family gather beside his bed just as they had gathered beside so many others? Or would death find him alone in a distant field beneath an ordinary sky? He could not know. No one ever could. And perhaps that uncertainty was the single experience every medieval person, regardless of wealth or station, ultimately shared. Kings wore crowns. Peasants carried plows. Monks copied sacred books. Merchants crossed dangerous seas. But every one of them eventually asked the same quiet question. Not whether death would come, only when. The years continued their quiet march, marked not by great victories or famous battles, but by the changing of seasons. Spring returned with carpets of wildflowers. Summers filled the air with the scent of freshly cut hay. Autumn covered the forests in deep gold and crimson, while winter wrapped the countryside beneath frost that glittered like crushed glass in the morning sun. Thomas was now an old man. Few people in his village remembered the young farmer who had once raced his freen. Across muddy fields after harvest. His hair had turned completely white, his shoulders had rounded, and his hands, once powerful enough to lift heavy beams without effort, now trembled slightly whenever he poured ale into a wooden cup. The scars remained. Not only the scar across his palm from the infection he had survived decades earlier. There were other scars no one could see. Every empty cottage he passed reminded him of someone whose voice had once echoed there. Every visit to the churchyard recalled faces that had slowly blurred with time but never truly disappeared. Age itself changed the way medieval people thought about death. When Thomas had been 20, death felt like an interruption. At 40, it had become a possibility. By 70, it had become a familiar companion quietly walking beside him. He no longer feared speaking about it. Neither did his neighbors. Modern conversations often avoid the subject of dying, treating it as something uncomfortable or inappropriate. Medieval people rarely possessed that luxury. Death remained too common, too visible, too woven into daily existence. One evening, while repairing a fishing net beside the river, Thomas sat with his grandson, Matthew, a curious boy of perhaps 10 years. The child watched dragonflies skim across the water before asking a question only children seem capable of asking with complete innocence. "Grandfather." "Yes." "Were you afraid during the great sickness?" Thomas remained silent for several moments. The river flowed gently around smooth stones. A kingfisher darted across the water before disappearing into reeds downstream. Finally, he answered, "Yes." Matthew looked surprised. "I thought brave people weren't afraid." Thomas smiled softly. "Being brave doesn't mean you aren't frightened." The boy considered this carefully. "Then what is bravery?" Thomas looked toward the fading sunlight. "Getting up the next morning anyway." Those simple words carried the weight of an entire generation. Millions of medieval people had awakened each day despite fear. They planted fields, buried loved ones, comforted neighbors, raised children, rebuilt villages, not because they believed everything would certainly improve, because life demanded that they continue. As Thomas grew older, he noticed another change within himself. His memories no longer arranged themselves by years. Instead, they gathered around people. He remembered harvests because they had been celebrated with particular friends. He remembered harsh winters because certain neighbors had survived them together. He remembered the plague not through dates, but through individual faces. Modern historians often measure medieval mortality using numbers. 1/3 of the population, half a city, millions across Europe. Such figures help us understand the scale of catastrophe. Yet they cannot capture what death truly meant to those living through it. For Thomas, the plague was not millions. It was Agnes smiling despite illness, Richard arriving with tired eyes, the blacksmith's booming laugh falling silent forever, his mother never seeing another sunrise. History records statistics. Memory preserves people. Late that autumn, Thomas found himself unable to complete even light work without becoming exhausted. At first, he dismissed it. Old age always brought new aches. But weeks passed. Walking uphill left him breathless. His appetite faded. Even lifting small bundles of firewood required frequent rests. His wife watched these changes quietly. Neither spoke openly about what they both understood. The body was slowly preparing for its final chapter. No mysterious epidemic. No battlefield wound. Simply age. For countless medieval people fortunate enough to avoid war, plague, famine, or childbirth, old age itself eventually became the cause of death. The village healer herself, now much younger than Thomas, visited several times. She checked his pulse, prepared warming broths, recommended rest. There was little else she could do. No medicine could reverse the passing of decades. Thomas accepted this calmly. One cold December evening, snow began falling heavily outside. His grandchildren gathered around the fire while wind rattled the wooden shutters. Thomas asked them to come closer. "I want to tell you something." The children settled quietly upon the floor. His voice remained gentle. "When I was your age..." He paused. "And I thought the strongest people were those who never cried." The children listened carefully. "I was wrong." His eldest granddaughter frowned. "You were." Thomas nodded. "The strongest people I ever knew cried often." He thought of mothers burying children, priests praying over endless graves, fathers comforting frightened families despite their own fear, neighbors sharing their last loaf of bread. They cried. He smiled faintly. And they kept helping others anyway. Outside, snow continued drifting silently across the sleeping village. The fire crackled softly. No one interrupted him. "I hope," Thomas whispered, "that you remember kindness longer than fear." Those words lingered within the room long after the conversation ended. Winter gradually deepened. Thomas spent more time resting beside the hearth than walking outdoors. Some mornings he watched sunrise through the small window without feeling any desire to leave his chair. His breathing had become slower, more deliberate. Each day demanded slightly more effort than the one before. Yet he remained peaceful. There were no desperate attempts to outrun time, only quiet acceptance. His wife often sat beside him spinning wool. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply listened to the fire. After sharing nearly 50 years together, silence itself had become a comfortable language. One afternoon, she reached across and gently held his weathered hand. "It has been a good life." Thomas smiled. "Better than I ever expected." She laughed softly. "You always expected disaster. I lived through enough of it." They both smiled. Outside, children laughed while throwing snow at one another. The sound drifted faintly through the window. Thomas closed his eyes. For a moment, he was young again, running across frozen fields, hearing his father's voice, watching his mother bake bread, seeing friends long buried beneath the churchyard. Memory possesses a curious habit near the end of life. The distant past sometimes feels closer than yesterday. Many medieval people described similar experiences. Long-forgotten moments resurfacing with remarkable clarity. Whether this reflected the mind searching backward through its own history or something more mysterious, no one could say. As Christmas approached, Father Andrew, the younger priest who had replaced Father Matthew years earlier, visited Thomas's cottage. He brought bread, warm wine, and conversation. They spoke not about death, but about life, about harvests, about grandchildren, about changing seasons, about old friends. Eventually, Father Andrew asked quietly, "Are you afraid?" Thomas looked toward the fire. He thought carefully before answering. "I was. And now." Thomas watched sparks rising slowly into the chimney. "I think." He smiled. "Yeah, I've spent my whole life learning how to let go." The priest nodded gently. No further explanation seemed necessary. Outside, evening settled across the village. The church bell rang softly in the distance, marking another ordinary day coming peacefully to its end. Inside the warm cottage, surrounded by family, Thomas rested quietly in his chair, unaware that before many more sunrises had passed, he himself would begin experiencing the final moments that every medieval person eventually faced, the long, deeply human journey from life into death. The first signs were so ordinary that almost no one recognized them as the beginning of the end. Thomas woke one morning feeling unusually tired. Not ill, not in pain, simply tired in a way that sleep no longer seemed able to repair. He sat on the edge of his bed while pale winter sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating tiny particles of dust drifting lazily through the air. Outside, a rooster announced the dawn with the same confidence it had every morning for years. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked at passing sheep. His wife was already stirring a pot of oat porridge over the fire. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Only Thomas felt different. He stood slowly, steadying himself against the wooden bed frame before walking toward the hearth. His wife looked up immediately. "You slept poorly." Thomas smiled. "I don't think I slept at all." She frowned gently but said nothing. There was little point arguing with old age. Everyone in the village knew that sleep often became lighter as the years passed. Over the following days, Thomas found himself eating less. The smell of fresh bread, once irresistible after a morning in the fields, no longer awakened much hunger. A bowl of broth seemed enough. Sometimes only a cup of warm ale. His grandchildren noticed first. "Grandfather," little Matthew asked one afternoon, "aren't you going to finish your bread?" Thomas looked at the untouched crust. "I think you should have it." The boy hesitated. "You always finish your bread." Thomas chuckled softly. "Perhaps today is your turn." No one forced him to eat. Medieval families had watched enough elderly relatives approach death to recognize familiar patterns. They understood these quiet changes even if they lacked modern medical language. The body slowly began asking for less. Less food. Less movement. Less effort. His wife added another blanket to the bed as the nights grew colder. Not because the weather had changed dramatically, because Thomas no longer seemed able to stay warm. His hands remained cool even beside the fire. His feet chilled quickly whenever he walked across the earthen floor. Old people often spoke of cold settling deep inside their bones. Whether this reflected poor circulation or simple aging, medieval people could not know. They only knew it happened. One afternoon, Father Andrew arrived unexpectedly. He carried no expression of alarm, only quiet concern. Thomas welcomed him warmly. The two men sat beside the fire while snow drifted gently beyond the doorway. For nearly an hour, they spoke about entirely ordinary things. The coming spring, the condition of the church roof, whether enough seed grain remained for planting. Neither mentioned death. Not directly. Eventually, Father Andrew asked, "Do you remember Father Matthew?" Thomas smiled immediately. "Every day. He once told me something." Thomas waited. "He said the dying rarely worry about death." The priest looked thoughtfully into the flames. "They worry about the people they leave behind." Thomas remained silent for several moments. Finally, he nodded. "That sounds like him." The conversation drifted elsewhere, but those words remained. The people left behind. That evening, Thomas watched his grandchildren laughing beside the fire. His eldest granddaughter was teaching the youngest how to weave thin strips of straw into small decorations. His wife hummed quietly while mending a cloak. The room glowed with warmth, with life, with ordinary happiness. Thomas realized that this, far more than fields or harvests or possessions, was what he would miss. Not great adventures, not unfinished ambitions, simply evenings like this. Several days later, he could no longer walk to the church without resting. The journey had once taken only a few minutes. Now he paused twice along the road, catching his breath beneath bare oak trees whose branches stretched dark against the pale winter sky. Neighbors noticed. No one commented. Respect often meant allowing an old man his dignity. Instead, they walked more slowly beside him. Without mentioning it, they matched his pace. That quiet kindness touched Thomas deeply. In medieval villages, people rarely lived entirely alone. Community formed an invisible safety net. When someone weakened, others naturally adjusted around them. A bucket of water appeared outside the door. Firewood arrived unexpectedly. A loaf of bread was quietly left on the windowsill. No speeches accompanied these gifts. Helping one another required no announcement. As January gave way to February, Thomas spent most of his time indoors. The chair beside the hearth had become almost an extension of himself. From there, he watched daily life continue. Children running through muddy lanes, women returning from the well, men repairing fences damaged by winter storms. Life moved onward with comforting familiarity. Occasionally, he closed his eyes and simply listened. The chopping of wood, the crackling fire, the distant ringing of church bells, the wind brushing against the thatched roof. These sounds had accompanied his entire life. He wondered whether they would be the last things he heard. One particularly cold night, Thomas awoke before dawn. The cottage lay completely silent. His wife slept peacefully beside him. Moonlight entered through the window, covering the room in pale silver. He found himself thinking not about fear, but gratitude. He had survived childhood illnesses, harsh winters, crop failures, the plague, injuries that might easily have become fatal. He had buried parents, friends, neighbors, and even children. Yet somehow he had remained. Long enough to become an old man. Long enough to watch grandchildren grow. Long enough to understand that life was never measured only by its length. It was measured by those with whom it was shared. When morning arrived, Thomas asked his grandson Matthew to help him outside. The boy wrapped a heavy cloak around his grandfather's shoulders before supporting him across the yard. Fresh snow covered everything. The village looked almost transformed. Every roof, every fence, every tree branch carried a layer of white so pure it seemed untouched by the hardships of the world. Thomas stood quietly, leaning upon a wooden walking stick. "It's beautiful," Matthew whispered. Thomas nodded. "It always was." The boy looked confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas smiled. "I was often too busy to notice." Those words lingered between them. How many medieval people spent their youth struggling simply to survive, only discovering the beauty of ordinary mornings near the end of life. They remained outside only a few minutes before the cold became too much. Returning indoors exhausted Thomas completely. For the remainder of the day, he scarcely left his chair. His wife exchanged worried glances with Father Andrew when the priest stopped by that evening. Neither needed to say what they both suspected. The time was growing near. There would be no dramatic announcement, no sudden collapse, simply a gradual closing of one chapter. As darkness settled over the village, candles flickered softly around the room. Thomas asked everyone to gather. Children, grandchildren, neighbors who had become family through decades of shared joys and sorrows. No one cried. Not yet. Instead, they spoke together. They remembered harvest festivals, old jokes, friends whose names had not been mentioned for years, stories of Father Matthew, stories of Agnes, stories of Richard the merchant whose arrival had unknowingly changed all their lives. Laughter occasionally interrupted the conversation. Even now, especially now, Thomas listened more than he spoke. Watching the faces around him seemed enough. When at last the room grew quiet, he looked slowly from one familiar face to another. I have had. He paused to catch his breath. More love than I ever deserved. No one answered immediately. His wife simply reached across and took his hand. Outside, snow continued falling silently across the churchyard, where generations of villagers already rested beneath the frozen earth. Inside the little cottage, the fire burned steadily into the night. And although no one could yet know the exact hour, everyone in the room understood that they were beginning the ancient vigil that medieval families had kept for countless generations, remaining beside someone they loved as he slowly approached the final threshold between this world and the next. The vigil began without anyone announcing it. There was no moment when a physician declared that only hours remained. No clock measured the passing of Thomas's final day. Instead, everyone simply sensed that life had entered its quietest chapter. The cottage felt different. Not frightening. Not mournful. Only still. The fire burned lower than usual, its orange glow casting long shadows across the timber walls. Beeswax candles flickered gently beside the bed, their small flames bending whenever a cold draft slipped beneath the wooden door. Outside, the village carried on with its ordinary routines. A farmer chopped logs. A woman called children home before sunset. Somewhere in the distance, a horse pulled a cart slowly along the frozen road. Inside, however, time seemed to move differently. Thomas no longer wished to sit beside the hearth. Walking even a few steps left him exhausted, so his family carefully helped him back into bed. They lifted him gently, arranging folded blankets beneath his shoulders so breathing became a little easier. No one had taught them to do this. Generations of experience had. Nearly every medieval family had cared for dying relatives inside their own homes. Knowledge passed quietly from parent to child, not through books, but through memory. His wife smoothed the blanket across his chest. You comfortable? Thomas nodded faintly. As comfortable as an old tree. She smiled through tired eyes. You've always compared yourself to trees. They stand a long time. He paused for breath, and then they quietly returned to the earth. No one interrupted. Silence had become as important as conversation. Throughout the evening, neighbors arrived one by one. Not crowds, only those who had shared life with Thomas for decades. The miller, the shepherd, the widow whose family Thomas had helped after the plague. Each entered softly. Each spoke only a few gentle words. Each left quietly after saying goodbye. Medieval communities understood something modern societies sometimes struggle to remember. The dying rarely need long speeches. They need presence, a familiar hand, a familiar voice, the reassurance that they are not alone. Father Andrew arrived shortly before nightfall, carrying a small wooden box wrapped in worn leather. Everyone in the room recognized it immediately. Thomas smiled weakly. I thought you'd come. I wouldn't be anywhere else. The priest knelt beside the bed. Their conversation remained private. No one else strained to hear. Thomas confessed old failings still resting upon his conscience. Moments of anger. Words spoken too quickly. Kindness he wished he had offered sooner. Not because he believed himself unusually sinful. Because nearly every medieval Christian hoped to meet death with an unburdened heart. When the confession ended, Father Andrew offered the final prayers and anointed Thomas with holy oil. The room remained completely silent. Even the children instinctively understood the importance of what they were witnessing. For medieval believers, this ritual was not merely tradition. It represented preparation for eternity. When the priest finished, Thomas opened his eyes. Thank you. Father Andrew gently squeezed his shoulder. You've spent your life preparing for this day. Thomas smiled faintly. I didn't realize it. The priest answered softly. Very few people do. Night settled completely. The snow reflected pale moonlight through the small window, making the room brighter than expected despite the late hour. Thomas drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes he murmured names. His father's, his mother's, old Agnes, Richard, Father Matthew. His wife noticed something curious. Whenever he spoke, his face appeared peaceful. Not frightened. Peaceful. Modern hospice nurses often describe similar experiences. Many dying people speak quietly to loved ones who died years earlier. Whether these moments arise from memory, changes within the brain, or something beyond scientific explanation remains deeply personal. Medieval families generally accepted such experiences without surprise. They believed the boundary between this life and the next had begun growing thin. Near midnight, Thomas suddenly opened his eyes. They seemed clearer than they had in days. He looked directly toward the ceiling, then slowly across the room. It's beautiful. His granddaughter glanced around, confused. There was nothing unusual to see. Only timber beams, candles, the familiar roof. "What is grandfather?" Thomas continued smiling. "The light." No one else answered. His family simply held his hands. Outside, clouds drifted away from the moon. Silver light spilled across the snow-covered village. The church stood quietly beneath the stars. The churchyard rested peacefully, each grave hidden beneath a smooth white blanket that softened every hill and every stone until the living and the dead seemed to share the same tranquil landscape. Hours passed. Thomas's breathing gradually changed. Each breath became slower, longer, gentler. His wife counted them without realizing she was counting. 1. Pause. Another. A longer pause. Then another. She remembered watching her own mother die decades earlier. The rhythm had been almost identical. Toward dawn, Thomas stirred once more. His grandson Matthew leaned closer. "Grandfather." Thomas opened his eyes just enough to recognize the boy. "Yes, I'll remember." Thomas looked puzzled. "The stories." A faint smile crossed the old man's face. "Good." He closed his eyes again. Those became the last clear words he ever spoke. Morning arrived quietly. The first rays of sunlight painted the frost outside with pale gold. Inside the cottage, everyone remained gathered around the bed. No one hurried breakfast. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the children sensed that this morning differed from every other morning they had ever known. Thomas's breathing had become almost impossible to hear. His chest rose only slightly, then rested, then rose again. Father Andrew quietly began reciting familiar prayers. His voice remained calm and steady. The words had accompanied countless villagers through their final moments. They now accompanied Thomas as well. His wife continued holding his hand. She felt its warmth fading gradually beneath her fingers. She leaned closer. "I love you." There was no reply. Only another slow breath. Then another. Outside, birds began singing as though welcoming an ordinary spring morning. The world paid no attention to the tiny cottage where one ordinary life was quietly reaching its end. And perhaps that is one of history's deepest truths. Most human lives do not end before cheering crowds or beneath magnificent monuments. They end exactly like this, in familiar rooms, surrounded by loved ones, accompanied by whispered prayers, and quiet tears and hands that refuse to let go until the very last moment. Thomas drew one final gentle breath. A long silence followed. Everyone waited. Another breath never came. His wife remained holding his hand. She lowered her head and kissed his forehead softly. No one cried immediately. Grief often begins with stillness. Father Andrew slowly made the sign of the cross. He has gone home. Those simple words settled over the room like the morning light itself. Outside, life continued. Children in neighboring cottages laughed while chasing chickens. Smoke rose from chimneys. The mill wheel turned steadily beside the stream. Spring sunlight warmed the frozen earth. Inside the little cottage, Thomas's journey, the journey of one ordinary medieval man who had survived plague, hardship, love, loss, and old age, had finally reached its peaceful conclusion. Yet for his family, another journey had only just begun. For in the Middle Ages, death did not end with the final breath. There remained the washing of the body, the long farewell, the funeral procession, the burial, the prayers for the soul, and the quiet work of learning how to live in a world where one familiar voice had fallen forever silent. Thomas's body remained exactly where he had died. No doctor arrived to officially pronounce the time of death. No undertaker came to collect him. In the Middle Ages, death belonged first to the family. His wife continued holding his hand for several minutes, almost as though warmth might somehow return. The children stood quietly beside the bed, unsure whether they should cry or remain brave. Father Andrew gently closed Thomas's eyes, crossing his hands over his chest before whispering one final prayer. Only then did the practical work begin. Death, however sacred, demanded labor. A large iron pot was placed above the fire. Fresh water was carried from the well despite the bitter cold outside. His daughters and granddaughters prepared clean linen that had been carefully stored for years. In many medieval homes, the finest cloth a family possessed was quietly saved for moments exactly like this. His wife unfolded the fabric slowly. "I made this," she whispered. The youngest granddaughter looked up. "When?" "Before your grandfather's hair turned gray." The girl frowned. "Why didn't you use it?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Some things are kept for the last kindness we can give." Those words settled gently upon everyone listening. The women carefully washed Thomas's body with warm water. They cleaned the dirt from beneath his fingernails. They combed his white hair one final time. The scar across his right palm, the old injury that had almost killed him decades earlier, remained clearly visible. His granddaughter gently touched it. "Is this from the fence?" Her grandmother nodded. He used to joke that the scar reminded him to be grateful. The little girl traced it carefully with one finger. "He kept it his whole life." "Yes, so will we." Simple details like that often survived longer than names written in books. People remembered scars, laughter, favorite sayings, the way someone smiled before speaking. History rarely records such things. Families never forgot them. Once the washing had been completed, Thomas was dressed in his cleanest tunic. It had been worn only during church festivals and family weddings. The cloth showed signs of careful repair over many years. His wife smoothed the wrinkles from the sleeves with remarkable tenderness. He always hated creases. A few quiet smiles appeared around the room. Even grief left space for small moments of warmth. Nearby, several men from the village had already begun another task. Thomas's coffin. Few ordinary medieval families owned elaborate caskets. Most coffins were simple wooden boxes built quickly from local timber. The village carpenter measured carefully before selecting several oak planks stored inside his workshop. He worked silently. His apprentice handed him tools without needing instructions. Hammer blows echoed softly through the cold afternoon. Each strike sounded deliberate, respectful. No one rushed. Although death required practical efficiency, haste would have seemed disrespectful. By sunset, the coffin stood complete. Plain, strong, unpainted. Exactly the kind of coffin Thomas himself would have expected. Meanwhile, news of his passing spread naturally through the village. No written notices appeared. No bells announced it immediately. People simply told one another. The old farmer Thomas passed peacefully this morning. Every household understood what those words meant. Neighbors began arriving carrying gifts. A fresh loaf of bread, dried apples, ale, bundles of firewood. Not because the family lacked these things, because mourning often left little energy for ordinary chores. Helping with daily necessities allowed the grieving family to focus upon saying goodbye. That evening, the cottage filled with familiar faces. This gathering, often called the wake in later centuries, served several purposes. People prayed, shared memories, comforted one another. Most importantly, no one allowed the family to remain alone. Candles burned throughout the night. Some believed this honored the deceased. Others simply appreciated the warmth and light. Stories gradually replaced silence. The blacksmith's son laughed while recalling how Thomas once accidentally chased a pig through the churchyard after forgetting to latch a gate. He blamed the pig. No, another neighbor corrected with a smile. He blamed the gate. Gentle laughter spread through the room. For a moment, grief stepped quietly aside. Remembering someone's life often proved just as important as mourning their death. Matthew, now older than when he had first asked his grandfather about bravery, listened carefully to every story. He feared forgetting. Already certain details seemed blurred. Had his grandfather's voice been deeper? Did he always walk with that old ashwood stick? Memory, he realized, could fade more quickly than expected. He silently promised himself to tell these stories someday to his own children. In that way, Thomas would continue living a little longer. Late that night, Father Andrew sat beside the coffin alone. The room had grown nearly silent. Only the fire cracked softly. The priest looked thoughtfully at Thomas's peaceful face. He had buried hundreds of villagers during his years of service. Infants, young mothers, old soldiers, victims of fever, victims of accidents, victims of plague. Yet every death remained unique because every life had been unique. People often imagine medieval priests becoming emotionally numb through constant exposure to death. Some probably did. Others never truly stopped grieving. Father Andrew quietly admitted to himself that he would miss Thomas. Not because Thomas had been extraordinary, but because he had been dependable. The sort of person whose quiet kindness strengthened an entire community without seeking recognition. Outside, snow began melting beneath an unexpectedly mild wind. Water dripped steadily from the edges of thatched roofs. The seasons continued changing, exactly as they always had. The following morning dawned bright and clear. Church bells finally rang. Slowly, deliberately, each toll echoed across fields where Thomas had worked for most of his life. Travelers passing along distant roads removed their hats instinctively. Another soul had departed. The funeral procession formed outside the cottage shortly before midday. 4 neighbors carefully lifted the coffin onto their shoulders. No horses, no elaborate hearse, only familiar hands carrying a familiar friend. His wife walked immediately behind. Children and grandchildren followed. Then came nearly the entire village. The road toward the church seemed strangely familiar. Thomas himself had walked it countless times. To baptisms, weddings, harvest festivals, and the funerals of parents, neighbors, and friends. Now others walked the same path for him. As the procession passed abandoned cottages left empty since the plague years, Matthew looked toward them thoughtfully. His grandfather had once explained that villages remembered people through places. Here lived Agnes. There the blacksmith. Beyond the stream stood Richard's old inn. Every doorway held a story. Every path carried invisible footprints. The church appeared ahead beneath a pale blue sky. Its weathered stone walls had witnessed generations arriving exactly as this family now arrived. Joyfully for baptisms, hopeful for marriages, sorrowfully for funerals. The building itself seemed almost timeless compared with the fragile lives passing through its doors. Inside, sunlight poured through stained glass windows, scattering gentle colors across the worn stone floor. Thomas's coffin rested before the altar. Father Andrew opened the familiar prayer book. His voice echoed softly beneath the ancient wooden roof. Everyone bowed their heads. Some wept quietly. Others smiled while remembering happier days. Outside, beyond the thick church walls, life continued exactly as Thomas himself would have expected. A shepherd guided sheep across distant hills. Children laughed beside the river. Smoke rose peacefully from village chimneys. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another child was being born into the same uncertain medieval world that Thomas had finally left behind. The funeral service was nearing its end. Only one final journey remained. The short walk from the church door to the waiting earth where generations of villagers already rested together beneath the same sky in the same quiet churchyard that had watched over them all for centuries. The church doors opened slowly. A cold spring air drifted inside, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, new grass, and distant wood smoke. For a brief moment, Sunlight illuminated Thomas's simple oak coffin before four of his oldest friends lifted it once more onto their shoulders. No one hurried. Funerals in the medieval world followed the pace of grief rather than the pace of clocks. The churchyard stretched quietly before them. Centuries of burials had transformed the ground into gentle rises and shallow hollows. Wooden crosses leaned slightly after years of rain and winter frost. Older graves had almost disappeared beneath thick grass, their names long erased by wind and time. Only the oldest villagers still remembered who rested beneath some of those forgotten patches of earth. Thomas had walked through this churchyard hundreds of times during his life. As a little boy holding his mother's hand. As a young husband after Sunday Mass. As a father bringing his children for baptisms. As a grieving neighbor attending funeral after funeral during the terrible years of plague. Now others carried him along that same familiar path. Matthew walked beside the procession, trying to keep his eyes fixed upon the coffin. He feared that if he looked away, even for a moment, the reality of losing his grandfather would somehow become permanent. Children often struggle to understand death. In the Middle Ages, however, they encountered it far earlier than most children today. Many had already watched grandparents die. Some had buried younger brothers or sisters. Others remembered the plague only through stories whispered by adults around evening fires. Death remained frightening, but it was rarely hidden. The grave had already been prepared. It rested beneath the large oak tree overlooking the eastern edge of the churchyard. Thomas himself had often paused beneath its branches after services, enjoying the cool shade during warm summer afternoons. Now those same branches swayed gently above the place where he would rest. The grave was not especially deep by modern standards. It had been dug by neighbors the previous afternoon, using iron spades worn smooth from decades of work. Fresh soil lay piled neatly beside it. Dark, rich, still carrying the scent of spring rain. The coffin was lowered slowly using thick hemp ropes. Every movement remained deliberate, careful, respectful. No machinery, only human hands. As the coffin settled gently upon the bottom of the grave, Father Andrew stepped forward. His prayer book rested open despite the breeze attempting to turn its pages. He spoke calmly, his familiar voice carrying across the silent churchyard. We return this body to the earth from which it came. The words were ancient, simple, understood by everyone present. The villagers bowed their heads. Some quietly crossed themselves. Others simply stood in silence. For several long moments, no one moved. Then Father Andrew stepped aside. This was the family's moment. Thomas's wife approached first. She knelt slowly despite the stiffness in her own aging knees. From her apron pocket, she removed something wrapped carefully inside a small piece of linen. When she unfolded it, everyone recognized the object. A tiny carved wooden bird. Matthew smiled through tears. His grandfather had carved it nearly 40 years earlier during a long winter evening. It had sat beside the fireplace ever since. She looked down toward the coffin. "You always said birds never truly belong inside cages." Very gently, she placed the carving into the grave. "I hope your journey is peaceful." She stepped back without another word. Matthew approached next. For several seconds, he simply stared downward. He wanted to say something meaningful, something worthy of his grandfather. Instead, he whispered only 4 words. "I'll tell your stories." No elaborate speech, no poetry, only a promise. Perhaps it was enough. One by one, other family members came forward. A daughter placed a small sprig of rosemary upon the coffin. Throughout medieval Europe, rosemary often symbolized remembrance. Whether every village understood precisely the same meaning mattered little. Its fragrance alone reminded people that memory could linger long after flowers had faded. One neighbor quietly laid down Thomas's old leatherwork gloves. They had become too worn to use years earlier, yet no one had thrown them away. Another smiled softly. He'd complain we're wasting perfectly good gloves. Gentle laughter rippled through the mourners. Even here. Especially here. Because remembering someone honestly meant remembering both tears and smiles. Finally, Father Andrew nodded toward the gathered villagers. The burial itself could now begin. According to ancient custom, Thomas's eldest surviving son stepped forward carrying a wooden shovel. He lifted the first small scoop of earth. Everyone listened. The soil struck the wooden coffin below with a soft, unmistakable sound. A hollow thud. Few sounds affected medieval people more deeply. That single sound transformed death into undeniable reality. Many later described remembering it for the rest of their lives. Thomas's son lowered his head, then handed the shovel to Matthew. The boy hesitated. Father Andrew gently placed a reassuring hand upon his shoulder. "It is all right." Matthew nodded. His hands trembled as he lifted another small amount of soil. When it fell, the sound seemed somehow quieter than before. Or perhaps he simply expected it now. Soon others joined. Neighbors, friends, family. Not because extra labor was necessary. Because participating in the burial formed part of saying goodbye. Eventually, the grave was filled completely. Fresh earth rose into a gentle mound. A simple wooden cross was placed at its head. The carpenter had carved Thomas's name only the evening before. Nothing elaborate. Just enough that future generations might know who rested there. Whether the wood would survive 20 years, no one could say. Rain would come. Snow. Wind. Time. The cross would eventually weather away, just as countless others already had. Yet memory did not depend entirely upon wood. It lived inside people. The mourners slowly began leaving the churchyard. Life called them home. Animals still required feeding. Bread still needed baking. Children would wake hungry tomorrow morning. Even grief could not suspend the necessities of medieval existence. Matthew lingered behind. He sat beneath the great oak tree, overlooking the fresh grave. For a long time he said nothing. Birds sang above him. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth through new leaves beginning to unfold after winter. He suddenly remembered something Thomas had once told him while standing beside the river years earlier. Being brave doesn't mean you aren't frightened. The words returned with surprising clarity. Perhaps bravery now meant something different. Not surviving plague. Not working through pain. Not facing old age. Perhaps bravery also meant learning to continue living after someone you loved was gone. When Matthew finally stood to leave, he looked once more toward the churchyard. Around him rested hundreds of ordinary people. Farmers, mothers, carpenters, children, priests, merchants. None had built great empires. Few had ever traveled farther than several days from home. Most left behind no written record beyond perhaps a name inside a parish register. Yet every one of them had loved someone. Everyone had been mourned. Everyone had once believed tomorrow would arrive. That, perhaps more than anything else, was what it truly meant to die in the Middle Ages. Not simply to perish from plague, famine, war, or old age, but to become part of an endless chain of ordinary human lives lived with quiet courage, ended with familiar rituals, and remembered not through magnificent monuments, but through stories passed from one generation to the next. And as Matthew walked slowly back toward the village, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ancient churchyard, while beneath the old oak tree, Thomas rested peacefully among countless others whose names history had largely forgotten, but whose lives had shaped the medieval world all the same. The funeral ended. The mourners returned home. The churchyard grew quiet once again. If this had been a modern story, it might have ended there with a peaceful burial beneath an old oak tree and a family beginning the slow work of healing. But for medieval people, death rarely ended at the graveside. The living still carried responsibilities toward the dead. As twilight settled over the village, Father Andrew remained alone inside the church. One by one, he extinguished the candles that had burned during the funeral mass. The familiar scent of melted beeswax lingered in the cool stone air, while smoke from the wicks curled upward into the darkness above. He paused before closing the heavy prayer book. Thomas's name rested on the final page he had read that afternoon. Tomorrow another baptism might be recorded. Next week perhaps a wedding. Eventually another funeral. The pages never remained empty for long. Life and death had always shared the same book. Outside, Thomas's family gathered for a simple meal. No celebration. No elaborate feast. Only warm broth, coarse bread, roasted onions, and quiet conversation. The youngest grandchildren did something that surprised the adults. They laughed. At first, their parents looked embarrassed. Then Thomas's widow gently shook her head. Let them. Everyone turned toward her. He always liked hearing children laugh. The room relaxed. Slowly, conversation returned. One person remembered Thomas teaching boys how to repair fences. Another recalled how he always whistled while sharpening tools. Someone laughed about the day he accidentally frightened himself after falling asleep beneath a hay wagon and waking after sunset believing ghosts had surrounded him. Even his widow smiled. He insisted for years that it wasn't fear. "What was it?" asked Matthew. He claimed it was professional caution. The room filled with gentle laughter. Grief had not disappeared, but memory had begun changing shape. Instead of dwelling only upon Thomas's final days, the family slowly returned to remembering the thousands of ordinary days that had come before. That quiet transformation often marked the beginning of healing. The following morning, Matthew woke before sunrise. Without speaking to anyone, he walked alone toward the churchyard. Thin mist drifted across the fields. Dew covered every blade of grass. Birdsong echoed through the valley exactly as it had yesterday. Exactly as it would tomorrow. Thomas's grave looked different already. The fresh earth had settled slightly during the night. A robin perched briefly upon the wooden cross before flying toward the nearby hedgerow. Matthew stood silently. He had expected overwhelming sadness. Instead, he felt something quieter, almost peaceful. His grandfather had once told him that every farmer eventually returned to the same soil he had spent a lifetime cultivating. Standing there, Matthew finally understood. The earth beneath his boots had fed generations. Now it also sheltered them. As he turned to leave, he noticed an elderly woman placing flowers upon another grave nearby. She smiled kindly. "You were at yesterday's funeral." Matthew nodded. "He was my grandfather." She looked toward Thomas's grave. "He was a good man." Matthew hesitated. "Did you know him well?" The woman chuckled softly. "I knew him when he still had black hair." Matthew laughed. "I can't imagine that." Neither could he toward the end. She adjusted the flowers carefully. "You know," she paused, "people think history remembers kings." Matthew looked puzzled. "It remembers ordinary people too." "How?" The old woman looked around the churchyard. "Through the lives they changed." Those words lingered in Matthew's mind long after she had walked away. Through the lives they changed. Thomas had never written a book, never commanded an army, never owned great estates. Yet dozens of people carried pieces of him within themselves. His patience, his stories, his generosity, his quiet courage. Perhaps that was another kind of legacy. Spring gradually deepened. The village became greener with every passing week. Children once again chased one another between cottages. Fields filled with workers preparing new crops. The mill wheel turned steadily beside the stream. From a distance, life appeared almost unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, every survivor carried invisible memories. Some remembered plague. Others remembered famine. Many remembered loved ones now resting beneath weathered crosses. The Middle Ages were often harsh, but they were also filled with resilience. Communities learned to rebuild because rebuilding remained the only path forward. Matthew inherited his grandfather's walking stick. At first, it felt strange carrying something so familiar. He almost expected Thomas to ask for it back. The smooth ash would still bore tiny marks where years of use had polished the handle. One afternoon, while helping repair a fence beyond the village, another yawned. Farmer noticed it. That was Thomas's. Matthew nodded. He left it to me. The man smiled. Then keep walking. Matthew frowned. What do you mean? He always said. The farmer leaned upon his shovel. As long as your feet keep moving, hope usually walks beside you. Matthew had never heard that saying before. Perhaps Thomas had spoken it years earlier. Perhaps only once. Yet someone remembered. Memory often survives in unexpected places. Seasons became years. Thomas's wooden grave marker slowly faded beneath rain and sunlight. The carved letters softened. Tiny cracks appeared in the timber. Eventually, moss began growing near its base. One autumn storm finally broke the cross in two. Matthew repaired it himself. Not because the wood mattered, because remembrance did. He remembered Father Matthew's old words from decades earlier. Someone should remember they were here. And so he did. Years later, travelers passing through the village occasionally asked about the Great Plague. Older villagers answered with familiar stories. Younger ones listened quietly. The plague slowly transformed from living memory into history. Children born after those terrible years knew it only through tales told beside winter fires. That is how history changes. Experience becomes memory. Memory becomes story. Story becomes history. Centuries would pass. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Castles would crumble. Churches would be rebuilt. Languages would evolve. Empires would appear and disappear. Yet beneath quiet churchyards across Europe, millions of ordinary medieval men, women, and children would continue resting beneath the same earth. Some died in battle. Some during childbirth. Some from fever. Some from old age. Many from plague. Each death different. Each life unique. Modern archaeologists would one day uncover their bones. Historians would study their tools. Scientists would analyze their teeth, their diets, their illnesses, and even traces of the diseases they carried. From these silent remains, the modern world would slowly piece together what it truly meant to live and to die in the Middle Ages. But no excavation could recover everything. No skeleton could reveal the sound of Thomas's laughter. No grave could preserve the warmth of his hand in his grandson's. No scientific report could fully measure the courage required to wake each morning in a world where death stood so close. Those things survived only in stories. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still find ourselves drawn back to these forgotten lives. Not because medieval people were so different from us, but because beneath the rough wool clothing, the smoky cottages, the muddy roads, and the ever-present uncertainty, they loved, feared, hoped, mourned, and faced the unknown in ways that remain profoundly human even today. Their world has vanished. Their castles have become ruins. Their villages have changed beyond recognition. Yet the quiet question that followed every medieval person from birth until their final breath is still the same question every human heart eventually asks. How should we live, knowing that one day we too must die? As centuries slipped quietly into history, Thomas's name gradually disappeared from living memory. His grandchildren grew old. Their children told stories that became a little shorter with each generation. Details faded, faces blurred, the exact sound of his voice was forgotten. Eventually, no one remained who had looked into his eyes or heard his laughter echo across the fields after harvest. The wooden cross above his grave weathered away completely. Rain softened the earth. Grass spread evenly across the churchyard until no one could point to the precise place where he rested. To an ordinary traveler passing through the village 200 years later, Thomas had become invisible. Yet he had not truly vanished. Every stone wall he helped build had sheltered another family. Every tree he planted had offered shade to children he would never meet. The fields he plowed continued feeding generations long after his hands had returned to the soil. History often measures greatness through crowns, castles, and conquests. But perhaps history survives just as much through quiet acts of kindness that leave no written record. The old widow he comforted after the plague. The frightened grandson he taught that bravery was not the absence of fear. The neighbors he helped rebuild their homes. Those moments lived on, carried invisibly from one life into another. Centuries later, scholars would dig carefully beneath churchyards like his. They would uncover worn bones resting side by side. Some skeletons would show broken arms that had healed years before death. Others would bear signs of arthritis from lifetimes spent farming. A few would still carry traces of plague hidden within ancient teeth, allowing modern science to identify diseases unimaginable to medieval physicians. Researchers would reconstruct diets from bones, estimate heights, discover childhood illnesses, learn how hard people had worked simply by examining worn joints. These discoveries would teach us much, but they could never reveal everything. No archaeologist could uncover Thomas's favorite joke. No historian could measure the comfort he offered his wife during long winters. No scientific instrument could recover the feeling of a grandfather's rough hand wrapped gently around a child's smaller one. Some truths disappear forever. Others survive only because someone chooses to tell the story again. Perhaps that is why medieval history continues to fascinate us. Not because people then were strangers, but because they were astonishingly familiar. They woke before sunrise, worked until exhaustion, worried about their children, laughed with friends, grieved those they loved, wondered what tomorrow might bring. And when tomorrow finally stopped coming, they hoped someone would remember that they had lived at all. To die in the Middle Ages was rarely dramatic. For most people, there were no glorious last speeches, no magnificent monuments, no songs written in their honor. There was a simple bed inside a smoke-darkened cottage, the warmth of familiar hands, quiet prayers whispered by those who cared, a modest wooden coffin carried by neighbors, fresh earth falling gently upon the lid. Then spring returned. Harvest followed. Children laughed again. Life continued just as it always had. That quiet continuation was not a betrayal of the dead. It was the greatest tribute the living could offer. Because every generation inherited the same fragile gift. A little time. A few loved ones. The chance to leave the world slightly kinder than they found it. And perhaps, if fortune smiled, someone who would speak their name after they were gone. So what was it truly like to die in the Middle Ages? It was painful far more often than anyone would have wished. It was uncertain almost every time. It was shaped by faith, family, community, and acceptance in ways that feel both distant and deeply familiar. Above all, it was profoundly human. The Middle Ages remind us that while medicine, technology, and society have changed beyond recognition, the emotions surrounding life's final chapter have changed very little. Love still gathers around the dying. Memory still outlives the body. Grief still slowly gives way to gratitude. And every ordinary life still carries a significance that history books alone can never fully capture. As the evening sun settles behind the ancient hills, the church bell rings one final time across fields where countless forgotten footsteps have long since faded into the earth. Somewhere beneath the grass, Thomas rests among millions of others whose names history scarcely remembers, but whose courage, endurance, and quiet humanity helped shape the world we inherited. Their journey ended. Ours continues. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.